All
Space
right. So hello, my name is Matt Raible. I'm an old-fashioned Java developer. Today I'd like to talk to you about reactive Java microservices. I just posted a blog post on this yesterday, and you might notice that the font for microservices in this image is Pacifico, and you might have seen it before on the JHipster website. And now you might be asking, what is JHipster? Well, JHipster started way back in 2013 as a way of just building a Spring Boot backend and an Angular front end. Julien Dubois is one of the founders, and he worked on a project where they were using Ant of all things. Even in 2013, they were using Ant, and they wanted to be able to invoke node processes and basically do everything from the tools they're familiar with. And as you know, most Java developers really weren't into the front end so much, so generating that code for the front end really helped the people that were working on that project. And then since then, it's become much more. We added microservices support, I think in 2015 or 16, and then we've added blueprints that allow you to override the default. So right now, by default, if you don't choose any options but the defaults, you'll get a Spring Boot backend and you'll get an Angular front end, and it'll all be using Maven to build it. And so if you wanted to use something else on the back end, you can use a blueprint to do that. For instance, there's a Kotlin blueprint that allow you to use Kotlin code instead of Java code. There's also being blueprints developed for things like Micronaut, Quarkus, even .NET and Node.js. So it's really become more of a platform. And that's why if you look on the website today, you'll see more platform nomenclature than generator nomenclature. But that being said, it is based on Yeoman, and Yeoman was always a way to generate apps or generate extensions or things like that. And we are far and away the most popular generator on Yeoman's site. So if you go to yeoman.com/generators, there we are at the very top. And you'll notice we have a whole bunch of cool new logos. When I first started with JHipster and doing JHipster talks, we actually just had a single logo. And so I kind of dressed up like this, and people were like, wow, you must have invented JHipster. But no, I just dressed up like a logo. So now we have a bunch of new ones. And I like to say it's almost like a choose your own adventure book these days, but as a tool. So how do you use JHipster? Since then, we've invented JHipster Online and start.spring.io. But you'll notice here's the old-fashioned way. You just use npm, you install it globally, and then you make a directory, cd into it. That's what the take command does right there. And then you just run it. And it basically prompts you for a number of options. And I did mention JHipster Online, which is similar to start.spring.io, and JDL, but I'll get to those in a minute. So there's many options when you run that JHipster command. First of all, you want to run this in a brand new directory. A lot of Java developers, when they run a command to create a project, they expect that directory to be created. Yeoman doesn't work that way, and neither does JHipster. So you'll actually have to be in an empty directory, or it'll pollute your whole directory that you're in with a whole bunch of files. So it gives you some choices. Do you want to create a monolith, a microservice, or a gateway? Do you want to use Spring MVC or Spring WebFlex? What authentication type do you want to use, like JWT or Session or OAuth? And then the database, you can use SQL or NoSQL, as well as the build tool and web framework. So there's also a bunch of other things that aren't in here that I didn't mention. There's an admin UI, there's boot swatch theme, so if you want to have a different bootstrap theme, and internationalization. So if you're using, outside the US, or you want to make it more accessible to other languages, you can do that. And if JUnit and Jest aren't good enough for testing, we also offer Protractor, Cypress, and Gatling too. And we have a marketplace where you can add your own extensions. So at this point, you might be like, is JHipster giving me the paradox of choice? So the paradox of choice, why more is less, is a 2004 book by American psychologist Barry Schwartz. And its core idea is that we have too many choices, too many decisions, too little time to do what is really important. And that's where JHipster differs. It does have a lot of choices, but we make them all work together. And so a lot of the team does the hard work to basically make them work together. And chances are, if you're building a microservices architecture like we'll build today with different databases and different things in each microservice, well, you're complicating things for yourself. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. So I mentioned JHipster Online. This is what it looks like. It's at start.jhipster.tech. So if you go there, there's not only JDL Studio, so you can log in and write your own JDL, but you can see the JHipster statistics, so you can do both of those without logging in. And then if you log in, you can, instead of answering the questions in a terminal, you can answer them in a web form, and then even push your app to something like GitHub or GitLab, or you can download it. So you have all those choices. And then JDL is really what's made JHipster so much more fun to demo. Because what JDL is, JHipster domain language, right? That's why we know we're hip, is because we have our own domain language. But it allows you to basically model out the relationships between your entities, define your applications, and in one file, you can basically generate your whole architecture. And so demos like the one I'll do today are much easier because we don't have to go in and tediously pick like each little thing. And when JHipster started, even if you wanted to generate entities, you had to run JHipster entity, and then it would answer questions for you. And you'd say, does it have a relationship with another field? And there was a lot of room for error, right? So by getting rid of those tedious options and making it all possible with JDL, it really simplifies things for developers. So the first ever commit was from Julien Dubois on October 21st, 2013. And the message was Hipster stack for Java developers. Yeoman, Maven, Spring plus AngularJS in one handy generator. So I did say it started out with Ant, and that's true, but it wasn't released until there was Maven support integrated. So the first public release, version 0.3.1, was launched December 7th, 2013. And since then, it's grown quite a bit. We had almost 2 million downloads in 2020 alone. So that was quite crazy. So this is all making me feel pretty hip. So I think I'll change my shoes. See my my hipster Converse, they're even Okta branded. So let me put those on real quick. And normally I'd have, fancy businessman shoes on, but working from home, I got slippers. So, hello, I'm Matt Raible. I'm a hick from the sticks, grew up in the backwoods of Montana, no electricity, no running water. Had to walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day, and it felt like it was uphill both ways. Crazy that I'm a computer guy and grew up without electricity, huh? Well, my dad was into computers, so we got Byte magazine in the 80s, and he drove 80,000 miles when he was getting his master's just in 1 year to commute back and forth to a local school in Missoula, Montana. So that's how I ended up in computers. I live in Denver, Colorado with my beautiful wife, Trish, and 2 awesome kids, Abby and Jack. You can tell this photo is a few years old because Jack's taller than me now. I also have a middle child. His name is Hefe. I bought him off eBay in 2004, and you could call him an expensive obsession. So if you have a similar obsession with Volkswagens, I'd love to talk to you after. I work for Okta. We do software as a service. Some people say we do users as a software service, but that's UAS, so I don't like to say that acronym. But just talking about Okta makes me feel a bit more hip, so I'm going to change my tie here. This is like the hardest part of the whole presentation. And then you got to like put your collar up, right? So you can get the new tie on. Here it is. Oh, yeah. It's handy that they have this quick release, though. There we go. And I like that I can see myself. You know, you do this at a conference and you don't even know your tie's all messed up like that and you keep going. So at least here with Zoom, I can see. I need to pull it out a little there. All right, looking good. So let's begin with a brief history of Spring and microservices. There's a lot of things that make up a reactive microservices architecture with JHipster. And so I wanted to talk about how we kind of got here and a lot of the building blocks that make up what JHipster provides. So Spring all started in October 2002. Rod Johnson published a book called J2EE Design and Development. And the ideas in there were so popular that people took it, created Spring, and Jürgen Haller got involved, and the rest is history. 2004 was Spring 1.0, and interesting thing about when Spring 1.0 was released is a couple of other frameworks that haven't quite done so well were released as well. Flex 1.0 and JSF 1.0. So that all came out around the same time. 2006, we got a lot better XML support with Spring. You know, we always had pages of XML to configure applications, but what came with 2.0 was XSDs and namespaces, so you could basically write less XML. And then 2009 JavaFig came about, and this was a big deal when it came out because you could use Java to basically configure your Spring apps instead of XML. But it didn't really catch on. Like, people kept using XML, and Spring started to get a bad reputation about so much XML that was required. And so it wasn't really, you know, Spring that was great. It was just like, it's like YAML nowadays with Kubernetes, right? Everyone hates YAML. People were hating XML because of Spring. And so then Spring 1.0 was released in 2014, and it all started from an issue entered into Spring's Jira that was like, hey, can we embed the web server like Tomcat into the actual app and make it work that way? And so that was a big idea, and it really took off. A year later, Spring Cloud was introduced, and Spring Cloud allowed you to connect and do a lot of the things that you need to do in a microservices architecture. So let's talk about microservices a bit. So way back in 2006 and 2007, the term microservice, 2 words, was mentioned at a couple different conferences, but it never really, you know, took off until around 2014. So I mentioned Spring Boot was released in April of 2014, actually April 1st. So they were daring like Google with Gmail, and they launched it on April 1st. These 4 guys, though, James Lewis on the top left, Martin Fowler, Adrian Cockcroft, and Jill Wallens, get a lot of credit for microservices. So James Lewis presented a lot of the ideas behind microservices at a conference in Krakow called 33 Degree, and Fred George was there and sharing similar ideas at the same time. So this is 2012, but the real thing that kind of broke it into the Java community was the article simply called Microservices that was published on Martin Fowler's blog, and that was on March 25th, 2014. So it's still like considered one of the definitive articles that defines microservices, and so that's why I wanted to mention it. And in there, he talks about Conway's Law. And Conway's Law is that any organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. And so what tends to happen in a lot of organizations is they have front-end developers, they have back-end developers, and then they have database engineers and stuff like that. So it's a very difficult way to produce software because all of these teams have to talk to each other, they have to rely on each other, and it's just a difficult way to do it. So when teams are separated along these lines, even simple changes can lead to a cross-team project taking time and budgetary approval, and so it's really difficult. And a smart team will basically optimize around this communication mechanism and do whatever they can in their realm. So for DBAs, they might create a bunch of stored procedures to do a bunch of stuff. And, you know, Java developers might end up writing a whole lot of SQL to get around, you know, doing things in the database. And so it just creates, you know, tension between the teams. And so this is kind of Conway's Law in action. And so what they advise with microservices is, you know, do one thing and do it well. So it's easier to work on small things and have a team that can basically start with an idea and take it all the way to production. So that team will have people on it that are DBAs, that will have product managers that can, you know, make the business requirements come to fruition. And then you'll have UI developers, you'll even have DevOps people that, you know, get it into production and monitor it. And then if that needs any maintenance, that same team can work on it as well. And so that's kind of the background of microservices, how they came to be. And Spring Boot is, you know, one of the de facto standards for Java now. It's kind of become the on-off switch of enterprise Java, in my opinion. And you notice that's how they design their logo. So everyone's using it and loves it. And if you compare it with even MicroProfile or any of the other, you know, frameworks like Micronaut or Quarkus, it's got such a head start that it's just so much more popular. It automatically configures Spring. It does all this stuff. It keeps your server, you know, in your application, and it provides these pre-configured starter pawns, and it supports Maven, Gradle, and has these dev tools that make it so you can just like save your class and it'll detect it and reload your app, and just makes it really nice. So Spring Boot 2.0 came out and basically added the ability to do reactive. So it all started with Spring, actually. Spring, I think 5 had reactive support from Project Reactor. and Spring 2.0 added that about 4 months later. So you can see now you have two choices. You have a reactive stack with Spring Webflux, and you have the servlet stack with Spring MVC. And so what it typically depends on is how much load you have, which one's a better choice. So if you're not doing 500 requests a second, Spring MVC is probably going to work just fine for you. If you really have that higher load, then Spring Webflux is going to work much better for you. And so, yeah, Spring Framework 5 was released in 2017, and then Spring Boot 2.0 was released in March 2018. So it's been around with this Webflux support for a couple of years. And funny story, like when I talked to Josh Long about, JHipster adding reactive support, he's like, that's 2 years ago. And he's right. So it took us a long time to implement it and get it all in there. And it is a whole different style of programming. It's a different API because instead of, sequentially doing things, you basically grab a stream and you operate on that stream until you return the result. So it's a little bit difficult to get your head around, but I think it's worth your while to learn it because it's a good tool to have in your belt. And so an API gateway is an integral part of a microservices architecture as a service discovery. And so when JHipster originally had Webflux support, it was probably 6 months after it came out, but it was just for a microservice. So one of the problems was we used Zool for our API gateway if you created one, and Zool 1.0 is blocking. And so it blocks the request. It's not non-blocking. It's not reactive. And so Spring Cloud Gateway was created by the Spring team, but also Zool 2.0 came out and it had reactive support. But Spring Cloud decided they didn't want to support it because they wrote their own. So Spring Cloud Gateway, I think, was driven by a lot of customer requests and customer requirements from Pivotal. And so it really, kind of helped them create this great product on the front end that allows you to do all kinds of things. And for some of the OAuth stuff I'm going to show you today, it's actually only 5 lines of YAML. If we weren't using YAML, it would be like 1 line to do the token relay from the gateway to the microservices. So I'm feeling even more hip after talking about, Spring Cloud Gateway and all. And you know what? I bought some light up suspenders like this and bow tie, but they didn't arrive in time. So maybe the next presentation I'll have those. Another thing I wanted to talk to you about that I think is a good idea to have in your microservices architecture is OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect, mostly because friends don't let friends write authentication, right? You don't want to be in charge of your users. You don't want to be to blame if there's a breach. And it's a nice way to communicate between microservices in a stateless way. So OAuth 2.0 has provided delegated authorization since 2012, and OpenID Connect added federated identity on top of that in 2014. So they're the same, right? You can't have OpenID Connect without OAuth, and OAuth doesn't provide identity, it just provides authorization. So if you want any sort of authentication, then you're going to need OpenID Connect. So Spring Security might make this a little confusing for you because they have OAuth 2 login as one of their configuration parameters. That shouldn't be a thing because OAuth doesn't provide login, but I think a lot of that's based on their experience with GitHub, which was using OAuth 1 or something like that. But basically, it gives us a standard spec that we can write code against. And as developers, I really like to be able to write a specific OAuth code and not worry about my identity provider, right? In JHipster, by default, we use Keycloak. And I'll show you today how to switch to Okta, but you should be able to use AWS Cognito or any of the providers as well. So how an OAuth flow works, what I wanted to show you is just how it used to work, or tell you how it used to work, and then show you how it works now. So in the old days, like 2005, 2006, you would sign up on LinkedIn or you'd sign up on Yelp. And at the end of your flow, it would prompt you to invite your friends. But the way it would do it is have you enter your username and password in to your Gmail account, and then it would look up your contacts and go do that. Well, there's no guarantee that they didn't keep your username and password and look at your contacts again. They probably didn't, but you never know. And so what they need is a way of delegating that authorization to a third party. So in the OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect example, you'll have a client who we're going to call Yelp in this case, and it's just a connect with Google button instead of that form with that username and password. And you in this scenario are the resource owner. So when you click on the button, it goes to an authorization server. You pass some parameters to it. The most important one is the redirect URI. and that's where you're going to come back to after you log in. So it's very important you get that right, or things will go wrong. And then you pass in some standard scopes. OpenID, you always need that in there when you're doing OpenID connect flows, and profile. For instance, in that ID token, you want to get that user's information back. And then if you're already logged in, you won't even see any sort of login, right, from Google or someone else. It would just, redirect you and you'd be in. Well, part of that is it might request consent. If it does show you that page and you do log in, it might say, hey, do you allow Yelp to access your public contacts? And it'll even display those scopes. And you might have seen this when you use Twitter to log in. It'll show you what that app can do. So if that app can like post to your Twitter timeline, maybe you don't want that, right? Maybe you want to say, I don't want to log in with this app because it's going to be posting on my behalf. After you log in, it comes back to that redirect URI, and it has an authorization code. And then there's a back channel, which means basically not in the browser, but between your app that sits on a server and the authorization server, it does an exchange. So it takes that code and it gets an access token and ID token. You can read that ID token, or you can go to a user info endpoint and get that user's information that way. So that's just kind of how OAuth works. And then on a microservices environment, it's very easy to use that access token to look up the user's information if you need it. There's also flows that you can use if you don't need identity and you just have like service to service communication. You don't really need to know about the user. You can set up those kind of flows too. There's basically like 6 different flows that OAuth supports. I just like to talk about authorization code flow because that's the gold standard, and that's what we have implemented in JHipster. Another important part of microservices architectures are Dockers and Kubernetes. I'm not going to go into them much. I'll show everything running with Docker today, but JHipster supports both, and I will write a blog post in the future that shows you basically how to take your microservices architecture and deploy it to the cloud. So now, demo time. Got my glasses here. See how the glare is. Not too bad. You ready? All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a microservices architecture with JDL. We'll run the apps and see how our end-to-end tests do, and then we'll switch from Keycloak to Okta, and then we'll run everything in Docker. And so I'm going to bring up a browser here. I think I have to switch screens that I'm sharing. Go to this one. And so if you go to developer.okta.com, here's where you can sign up for an account. But if you look at our blog right here, this is just a link to the blog post I published yesterday. You can see it's right on the top there. And then if you were to click into it and scroll all the way down to the bottom, it goes to this GitHub repo that's got all the completed code. And it's also got this demo.adoc for ASCII doc that I'm going to use to, my steps for this, so I don't have to memorize everything. So if I click raw, then I use an ASCII doctor plugin that makes it look, kind of nice here. And we can just put those steps over there. So we're going to create a microservices architecture with Spring Boot, Spring Cloud Gateway, and Spring Webflux. So the gateway will use Postgres with R2DBC. That's a project from Spring Data for reactive access to databases. It's got its own set of drivers. The blog will use Neo4j. That's new support that we have in 7. And the store will use MongoDB just because that was the original reactive way of doing databases. So we do have JHipster 7 installed here, and you'll see Java 11. I also have Node 14.5.0. So it says to create a directory and call it reactive stack. So take is that command that does make dir and cd if you're using omyzsh. So reactive stack, we'll call it. And then this is what I like to do when I'm generating microservices with JHipster, because it basically expects each app to be independent, and it's in its own Git repo. So, if you have Git installed, it'll create a Git project, initialize it, and commit everything after it creates the project. If you're doing microservices and you have everything in the same directory and you want to keep it in its own repo, then you want to do Git init first, so it won't actually create those little, Git directories in each project. And then we have this JDL here that we define 3 apps, right? We have Gateway, Blog, and Store. You'll see reactive is true on all of them. And then the package name, obviously that could be different between them. I'm just keeping them the same. The authentication type is OAuth 2. You want to make sure that's the same between all of them. In a microservices environment, your only other option is JWT. And we did have UAA as an option. And what that would do is it would generate your own authorization server. But like I said, friends shouldn't let friends write authentication. So we're actually removing that for JHipster 7. If someone is so passionate that they do want to maintain an authorization server, we could rekindle that, but we're in the process of removing that. Build tool is Gradle, just because everyone uses Maven. So it's fun to use Gradle every so often. And you'll notice the client framework here is Vue. So that is new in 7 that we have that as part of the main generator that used to be a blueprint. And then database Postgres, you have to have the service discovery type for all of them as Eureka, or you could do console. I'm just doing Eureka in this instance. And then I have Protractor for the front end. The other backends don't actually have any UI. And so one of the things I hope to fix in 2021 is micro front ends. So each microservice will have a UI on top of it and they get sucked in instead of, because right now we have a monolithic UI and you're kind of defeating the points of microservices if you're doing that. So that's everything as far as applications. You'll see there's entities here. These point to things down below. The blog is gonna, well, the gateway has all of them, right? That's because it's a monolith UI. And then the blog has those entities, blog, post, and tag. And then the store just has a product. And so you can see the entity definitions here and the relationships between them, and then pagination rules. And you do have to specify that they're microservices and how those entities bind to the microservices. And then the last one is just some Docker configuration. So the cool thing is we have a lot of these samples in a JDL samples repository, and it'll pull right from it. So if I do JHipster, JDL, reactive MS, even .jdl, it'll pull that from the repository. So I don't have to copy it locally if it's already up there. And you can see that, it didn't find it in like the branch. So we do version them, but it did find it in the main branch there. So it's going to go ahead and create all those in parallel. And if anyone has any questions, they can certainly ask them now. It does take a little while. The back end is usually pretty fast, but the front end does run npm install, so that can take a minute or so. So as part of this process, several Docker compose files will be created, and that allows us to start up the back-end databases like Postgres and MongoDB, as well as the JHipster registry, which is our Eureka server. That also has a Spring Cloud config server in it. So that allows us to configure all our microservices in one central location. And then we have a keycloak for OAuth 2 and a Docker container. And that works really nice, especially because we can actually pre-configure and load all the data into that keycloak database. And we can even do that for the databases as well, because they have this thing called faker.js that we use, and that populates it with fake data when you're in a development profile. And that's kind of nice because as developers, we typically test things by inputting data and see how it works. And if the data is already there, it just saves one extra step. So when we're going to run this, microservices architecture, we're going to need to start keycloak first, because if that's not running, then no one can figure out how they authenticate. And then Postgres, and then look, there's my first typo. All right, that should be the JHipster registry. So here's the commands. We'll cd into the gateway. As soon as that's done, well, we don't have to wait. It's just npm install. So we'll go into gateway and bump the fonts a little. And we'll go ahead. And I have a JHipster plugin installed for OMyZSH. So I can just do JH keycloak up, and it'll run that docker compose -f command for me. And then I can also do Postgres. So JH Postgres up. And I actually have Postgres running up here. So I have noticed that if I don't quit it, then there's a conflict and it won't start up. So JH Postgres up. And that will only be used in the production instance. So if we actually start our app without doing a -p prod for the production profile, then it'll use H2. And then the JHipster registry, so JH registry up. And you'll notice up here, when it generated that Docker configuration, it said, hey, you need to generate Docker containers if you want to run everything with Docker Compose. So we'll get to that in a minute. But if we were to go into other apps, so we're in the, let's start up the gateway first since everything's running. So Gradle W. And Gradle and Maven both have the ability to define default goals. That's why you don't see me doing like boot run, or if you're using Maven, Spring Boot :run, just because I don't have to here. So then we'll open up another window. And I'll close these two because their fonts are a little big. That one's gone, okay. And we'll go to the blog. And it has Neo4j, so we need to start that one up. And then we'll start it up the Gradle process. And then our last one is the store. And we need to start up MongoDB. And you might be wondering, like, how do you remember what all the Docker containers are? Well, what I usually do is I just do ls source main Docker and look in there to see the ones I might need to be started. You don't have to use this one like the JHipster Control Center, but you can, and that can control and manage all your apps. MongoDB cluster is another option. You'll see even Sonar over here, and you could start those and run all your tests against it and see what your grade is in Sonar, but you don't have to. So this one we'll just start up with Gradle W as well. And so the backend microservices are going to start much faster because they don't have a front end, right? They don't have to do any npm stuff. The gateway takes a little longer because it is running npm install as part of the Java process. And so if we were to go and look at the JHipster registry at localhost 8761, you'll see it redirects us to Keycloak to log in. We just use a standard admin. And it shows that one instance is up. And I don't know if you saw this, it was kind of quick, but if we log out and log back in, this is one thing I forgot to mention in my blog post, I should go back there and add it, is you'll see up here, Keycloak is there. And this is because Docker containers, usually when they talk to each other, they have a logical name like Postgres or something like that. They just use host names. Well, in this very rare instance, we have a Docker container that's talking to the client. And so what we have to do to make this work is you have to go modify your etc host file to say Keycloak goes to localhost. And without that, it won't work. We do have that in the docs for JHipster, but I think I left that out of my blog post. So everything's up and running here, and we can go and log into the gateway and click sign in. And we're logged in using Keycloak, and we have our entities here, right? We have a blog, for instance. And that's already got some data in there from, the last time I did this. So if I could go ahead and delete that. And then if we were to talk to the product, right, that's a MongoDB instance, we could say, beer these days has really gotten expensive. It's like, Norway prices is up to $10. And then you can even add an image in here. And that's all working. So it's talking to all those microservices just fine. And all that's working. So now I want to switch to using Okta. Just to show you how easy it is. I could run the npm run E2E, that's the protractor test, and it would walk through the whole UI. But one thing I've noticed that's weird is it stops on the first edit screen of the first entity. And if you stop it and restart it, it'll make it to the next entity. And so there's some weird stuff going on there. We do have Cypress support that seems to be a little more reliable. And that's currently in progress to be fixed. If you click on this issue and go look at it in GitHub, you'll see there's a bug bounty on it and there's people working on it. So that should be rolling out hopefully within the main JHipster 7 release. So Keycloak works great locally, but I think when you go to production, you want something that's always on like Okta, and you don't really want to manage your identity provider. You'd like to, outsource it. So Spring Security makes that super easy. It's OAuth support. We haven't really done anything beyond what it gives us. You just have to override 3 properties: the issuer, the client ID, the client secret, and you'll be talking to Okta. And so Spring Cloud Gateway also makes it super easy to relay an access token after you log into those downstream microservices. It's just 5 lines of YAML. And if you didn't want to do it that way and you want the microservices to not have identity, you could configure, different clients and different apps for that and do service-to-service communication. So we have this thing called the Okta CLI that makes it super easy to create a new Okta account. So if I was to open up a new terminal and do Okta register, that would create a new account for you. I already have one, right? It detects that, so I don't have to. And if I did Okta login, it'd give me the URL that I could go log into my account. Well, to integrate JHipster with Okta, all you have to do is Okta apps, create JHipster. And then we'll give it a name like JHipster. And it'll prompt you with the default redirect URI. And it already knows that this is the one we want to use for JHipster. So Spring Security has specific Okta support, and in that case, this is the redirect URI that they would expect you to use. But with JHipster, because we switched between Keycloak and Okta, we didn't want to have a specific, one named Okta or Keycloak. That's why we just use OIDC. So you accept that one. You need a post logout redirect URI as well. And the other things it does is it creates the OIDC application. It adds those redirects, and then it adds a groups claim, right? So you need that because JHipster expects either a role admin or a role user group. And then it adds your user to those groups, and it creates a group. So it does everything for you, and then it writes it all to this .okta.env file. So if we were to cat that and look at it, you can see the client ID, the client secret, the issuer URI. And if we just wanted to change this one app, maybe we had a monolith or something, you could just run source export on that. And then if you started, Gradle from that, it would have those environment variables in there, not source export, but source okta.env. And then it would set those and it would override the defaults. But in this case, what I would like to do is use JHipster registry and Spring Cloud config. So if we modify this file here, we can put these values in it. So I'll go ahead and open everything up in IntelliJ. And then we can add them that way. I'll copy this over here. And this is probably one of the things we deal with the most is you'll see I have angle brackets here, but sometimes we use like curly braces. And so many times people leave those curly braces in there. So it's tough to come up with placeholders. That's what I've learned like in documentation to really indicate to people, hey, you need to replace everything in this string. So we do have IntelliJ opening up in my other window here. So put that on the right there. And then I said we're looking for that application config file, application.yml. And we're not in the central config server, and we're not in Docker Compose. We're in Gateway, and we want it to be this one, right? The local host config. And then we'll paste this in there. And then we have this okta.env right here, so we can grab the client ID there. And then the client secret. It's a little longer. And you can't just click it or you'll miss all of it. So be aware of that if there's any special characters in there. And then also the issuer. So that's right here. Oh, I need to move that over since Zoom's getting in my way a bit. All right, so now what we can do is restart everything. So everything running terminals here. Let's make sure these are all, well, we don't have to exit, but we do want to stop the JHipster registry since we changed that. And I've done this successfully without stopping it, so I'm not sure that's necessary, but I also ran into a few issues after I did it. So this is like the best way that I'll have a successful demo. And I do expect that error. I have seen that before, but it did stop successfully. Another cool thing that I learned is there's a shortcut here from these aliases that JHipster registry logs. So you can tail the logs if you want, which can be handy to see if it started up. Because if it didn't start up, then none of your microservices are going to work as well. So that's the gateway. So we'll start up the gateway there. And then start these up as well. And then one of the things I recommend is after this is all up and running and you want to prove it works, use an incognito window, because if you're using your current window, there might still be cookies or access tokens like stored in your local browser. So I do recommend that a lot if you run into issues, and especially if you're switching providers like this, because if there's any sort of ID token left around or access token like from Keycloak, it's not going to work with Okta and everyone's going to get confused. So we'll go back here and new incognito window and localhost 8080. Now if we're to sign in here, and it comes back and we're logged in with Okta. And so we can see our entities, right? We can see our tags. We're talking to that microservice, okay. We can see, our product. And we could add new ones as well. So that's all working. Back to the instructions. there is a cool feature that we have the ability to export your end-to-end username. So by default, it uses admin because that's what Keycloak uses. But if you wanted to test with Okta, you can export your credentials and then run npm run end-to-end that way, and it'll actually use your Okta credentials. So you could use it in a continuous integration environment. But one of the things that I like to recommend is that you use Keycloak in testing, right? So you don't use up any of your rate limits, and then use Okta in production. But we do plan to add CI for JHipster against Okta so we can identify any issues there. So now we can stop everything because what I want to show you is how to do this all with Docker Compose. So we'll exit out of these windows and clear this one. So we do still have a lot of Docker containers running. So if you do Docker PS, you'll see all those. I have a shortcut called dstop that'll stop them because you don't want conflicts. You know, with your Docker Compose, it might work. It might detect that they're already running and not try to start them. But I like to start with a clean slate because you know how the demo gods work, right? It doesn't always work. So we have to do this to build up our Docker containers in each directory. And so with Maven, you could actually have like an aggregator POM, they call it, at the top level. And then you could run that command to build all of them. And I searched around, and Gradle doesn't really have that ability. So you will have to go into each one and build the Docker containers. The cool thing is we're using Jib, which is a great project from Google that makes it so the Docker container builds faster and faster and only uses like your change files. And I don't know if you've seen this, but Spring Boot 2.4 has built-in Docker support. And so you can do, I think it's like if you're using Maven, it would be Spring Boot build-image. And it uses a similar thing that Jib does where it only rebuilds what it needs to. So it puts like layers of your application, the jars that are your dependencies in one layer, and then your application code in another. And so obviously the jars won't change that much, but your application code will. So it just builds faster each time. So then we have some files we need to modify. So back to IntelliJ and this Docker Compose directory. The first thing we can do is get rid of Keycloak because there's no reason to start that if we're going to use Okta. So down here, we can kill that. The other thing that I didn't show you is if you tried to go to the JHipster registry, which is on 8761, after you've changed it to use Okta, it'll actually won't work because you haven't added that redirect URI to Okta. So maybe I'll demo that and show you how to change it. But we have this application.yml that we need to update that's in a different location than this one. So we can just copy this. And this one's in central server config, app YML. And we do support storing like your configuration in Git. So that's something that I do plan to explore in the future and write a blog post about it. Because right now storing like your client secrets like this raw and checking them into source control, not a great idea. If you do it, make sure and delete that app like right after you do it because it's not good to have those available for people. And then we'll need to run Docker Compose up once all these are built. So it looks like they're all built. We can exit out of these ones. And yeah, we can run Docker Compose up. You can also do -D, and that'll run it as a daemon. I like to do it this way so you can see like everything running. So you need to be in that Docker Compose directory. And you'll see all of them start up. And because I have color going, like they're color coded and work in different colors. While that's starting, I'll mention Kotlin microservices. I did mention we have that Kotlin blueprint. So if you were to install generator JHipster Kotlin, and then it has a special khipster command instead of JHipster, you can do that and it'll generate everything. Because that JDL has no specifics about Kotlin or Java, it doesn't say anything about, you know, even Spring Boot or Spring Cloud. So you could, in theory, use that same blueprint for, or that same JDL for something like Micronaut, even Node. And it may or may not work. But the Kotlin blueprint does not have support for JHipster 7. So I recommend watching the project if that's something important to you. It'll probably be out shortly after the general release of JHipster 7, which is anywhere from a couple days to a few weeks away. So the store is starting up here. We got most things going. Also deploying to the cloud, we've got support for AWS, Azure, Heroku, and Google Cloud Platform, and Kubernetes, so you can actually generate that. And my blog post shows this a bit better. I don't know why it gives me that, but Ray Sang and I just last week deployed this whole setup to Google Cloud. And so he showed how to do that with Kubernetes. I plan to write a blog post on that as well. But let's do an incognito window and see if everything's up and running here. First of all, let's look at that registry. So localhost 8761, right? This is going to redirect to Okta, but it's going to give me this error. And so this is what I wanted to show you, because so many people struggle with this error and they don't realize that the redirect URI is not in the app. And if you look, it's right here, right? And so I tried to get Okta to take that value and put it down here, right? It should say the redirect URI parameter and then have it, but it doesn't. So if we were to log in and go right to our app, we can add it, and then that'll allow us to log in. And it's just the same as the JHipster one, because the JHipster registry is a JHipster app, but it's got a different port. So we can grab this and add it, and 8761. And I do think it's a bug with our CLI that it should add that by default for JHipster. So you might not have to do this in the future, but for right now you do. And then you can just refresh and it'll actually log you in. So that will work that time. And then if we were to go to like the gateway, right, localhost 8080, we can sign in there. And thanks to single sign-on, we don't see a login form anymore. And we're logged in and we can see all our entities, and that's all working. So just to prove it's working, you want to see me add one or not. So beer has gone up. It's now $15. Norway prices, and beer and savings. So it's communicating with those microservices and everything's working there. So close that down. And one of the questions that people ask is, should I go reactive? I think it's a good skill to learn, but like I said, if you're building a CRUD app like we did here, maybe it's not the best thing. Like, you don't really need it because Spring MVC is good enough. If you're dealing with massive amounts of data and you have that 500 requests per second, then it's possible that Spring Webflex will save you on your cloud bill because it uses less resources and can still, put more data through. There's also Project Loom, which I plan to explore in the future. That basically has a promise or a notion that you might be able to write non-reactive code and it performs as good as reactive code. So who knows, that is coming out this year. I'm still, betting on reactive, but I will look into Loom and try it out and do some tests there. So you can see all the code is in that repository on GitHub, and of course my blog post. So now I'll go back to my presentation here. So you learned about microservices. We learned about Spring Boot and JHipster, Spring Cloud, and OpenID Connect and Okta. So a lot in there. The blog post is on the developer blog. There's a link there, and I will post these slides. I've already posted them. I just haven't made them public. What's next for JHipster? I've been working on the Spring Boot 2.4 support. They did change quite a few things, and R2DBC went from an experimental project to part of the core, and they added like a template that you're familiar with from Spring Data. And so there's some work to do there, but I think it's close. I think maybe another week will be upgraded. I don't know if it'll make the 7 release, but it should be released shortly after there. Micro front ends, like I mentioned, currently in a microservices environment, we generate a monolithic UI, which I don't think is great. So I think we could do better. And I personally have an interest in GraphQL support for JHipster. Probably start that as a module where it just augments your existing application. And there's an open issue for that, or actually it's closed. So if you wanted to go and look at it. And one of the questions I asked is, for people, do they care if it keeps those existing REST endpoints? Do they want an entity generator, or how would they want their GraphQL implemented? And so there's a few questions there on how we do it. If you're interested in just how we made OAuth work between the microservices, since I didn't dig into the nitty-gritty details here, Spring Cloud Gateway and OAuth is a great post that I wrote, Reactive Microservices with Spring Cloud Gateway. You can see, it's funny, so great story here. I had this simple example of a Volkswagen, right? Because I like Volkswagen. So I just had a backend that returned a number of the new Volkswagen cars that are coming out, the electric ones. The one I'm excited about, I think, is called an ID Buzz, and it actually looks like the old bus. And there's a few other ones. And so I just set it up to have a backend, and then on another microservice, like it takes all those and just strips them out. So there's only one that's returned, your favorite one, if you go to a certain endpoint. And so for me, that was ID Buzz. And I published this, and I actually got a message from someone that worked at Volkswagen that was like, how did you know our architecture works this way? And I was like, I didn't. Like, it was just, it was my example. And so it was funny that this diagram they took as like I worked there and copied it from their systems, but I didn't. So the JHipster mini book is way out of date. If you're looking to get up to date on JHipster 7, then it's probably not going to help you. But not a lot has changed between 6 and 7 when it comes to the things that are in the JHipster mini book, because a lot of the stuff I talk about is just the defaults. But I do plan on upgrading it for 7 this year. It's free from InfoQ, quick and to the point, 164 pages, shows you how I developed an app called 21 Points. 21 Points is pretty cool because it allows me to track my health. Basically, you can get 21 points in a week. And if you exercise, you get a point. If you, don't drink, you get a point. And if you eat well, for me, that's no sugar, then you get a point. So I typically try to get 15 to 18 points in a week. I found if I get 18 points, I'll lose weight. 15 points, I'll maintain it. And below 10, I actually get sick. So, back in travel times, like if I got below 10 and I'm traveling a lot, like I didn't blame my kids for getting me sick. I knew it was my fault. I don't get 15 points a week in COVID times. I'm lucky to get like 12. And in fact, I stopped using the app. So when COVID's over, maybe I'll start using it again. If you want to learn more, I suggest Spring Boot has a number of guides. So if you're just looking to get familiar with Spring Boot, their guides are great. JHipster.tech is where all our documentation is, and Okta's APIs are on developer.okta.com. My personal feeling is you shouldn't really have to learn all of our APIs. You shouldn't have to learn about OAuth if it just works. Also, I have been an independent developer for most of my career before I joined Okta, so I would often use Stack Overflow as my lead developer. I recommend you do too. Developer.okta.com is our blog. We have lots of tutorials on OAuth and a number of different web frameworks, Angular, React, and Vue, as well as Spring Boot, Spring Cloud, and Ionic, and a lot on JHipster. So the action that I would encourage you to do is try JHipster 7, especially now while it's in beta, because you might find some bugs and those will get fixed, when the major release is coming out. So now that I'm a full hipster, I have this St. Bernardus that I'm going to crack open. If you haven't heard of St. Bernardus, it's a Belgian quad. And on the list of the best Belgian quads in the world, it's number 2. So Dennis Sharp, who's on the call, and I have had good ones before, and hopefully it doesn't spill all over my desk. Nope. All right. So I'll enjoy this. And
really good.
It is really good. And it gives you a different kind of buzz. I don't know what I'd call it, but, when it's 10%, that kind of thing happens. And use the source. If you need the source, there it is. If you have any questions, hit me up on Raible Designs or on Twitter. My DMs are wide open. This presentation, I'll upload it right after this and tweet about it on SpeakerDeck. And the code that I write these days, a lot of times is an Okta developer. So may the auth be with you.